Welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and our guest today is Phil Hine. Phil is a writer on esoteric subjects, and we're going to be talking today with him about a curious and lesser-known episode in the history of religious studies. Phil, welcome, and thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
Our subject for today is the role of the phallus, the penis, in theories about religion. For many people, this will be a bizarre subject, perhaps even blasphemous. Those who have heard about these theories will probably assume that they had something to do with Freud. But it's actually a much older story, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, for me, it started many years ago. I was on an occult discussion board, and there was these people having this really heated argument about thelema and the role of gender and sexuality within, thelemic belief. And this guy popped up suddenly, and he was going, "Well, it's because of Crowley believed in the solar phallic religion." And he said, it's all in Payne Knight. It's all in Payne Knight. You just need to read Richard Payne Knight's book, Discourse on the Worship of Priapus, and all will be revealed. And I thought, this is really weird. This is a group of people trying to tease out the complexities of contemporary sexuality and gender issues. And there's this guy referencing this book written in the 18th century. So I thought, this is kind of intriguing. And I was vaguely familiar with Discourse on the Worship of Priapus, but I read it again, and then I started thinking, this could be an interesting subject for a lecture. So I started to do some digging, and what I uncovered was, this fascinating and bizarre story about this idea that all religious worship, in effect, is rooted in the worship of the phallus. And as you say, this was kind of quite a bizarre idea, but it's an idea that has a lot of legs. We see, I found that Richard Payne Knight's work is referenced by Freud and Jung, and by a lot of the early first generation sexologists like Havelock Ellis, also by Margaret Murray, Gerald Gardner, Bjorn Fortune, Madame Blavatsky, Crowley. In fact, Payne Knight is one of Crowley's so-called thelemic saints. So I started to look at, as I looked more and more into the subject, I thought this is a text that has gone in a lot of different directions and influenced a lot of people. And at the same time, we've got the diggings at Pompeii and Herculaneum, where suddenly this kind of 18th century idea of Romans and Greeks as these austere noble cultures, that idea is getting shattered when they dig up statues of Pan copulating with a she-goat. And as I dug more into Payne Knight and his background, I turned up a cast of curious characters. There was Sir William Hamilton, who was the official British envoy to the court of Venice, I think, married to Lady Emma Hamilton. Of course, she had a famous torrid affair with Nelson. There was just this swirl of all this really interesting stuff going on at the time. Payne Knight is a very interesting character because he was very much an anti-clericalist. You see it in a lot of writing. He's really down on Christianity. And I think Discourse on the Worship of Priapus, this treatise that he co-authored with Sir William Hamilton, it's a kind of an early essay in comparative religion, if you like.
Yes, and it's a very interesting book. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. I should say, but by way of background, you mentioned Sir William Hamilton. The story, I think, begins in 1781, and Hamilton reports this very unusual custom that he's heard about from this Italian town, a town called Isernia.
Isernia,
Yeah, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, this little town in central Italy, and of course this is a solidly Catholic place, and they're celebrating the feast of two Catholic saints, Cosmas and Damian, and it appears that there are these wax penises that are being offered for sale, and the people buy these penises and they present them to the priests together with a gift of money. And I believe some of the penises have ended up in the British Museum. I don't know if
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
Can you see them today?
I'm not sure. I presume they're somewhere,
Yeah. It's not the sort of thing you'd throw out.
Yeah, but and that's correct. I mean, Hamilton didn't actually see this. I think he got an account of it from somebody else, and he kind of described it third person. But he took this as a kind of like a survival of ancient phallic worship.
Yes.
I think the whole thing got suppressed before from what I can recall from reading his essay, he wanted to go and see this for himself, but by the time he got to a certain, the whole thing had been pushed up by the clergy.
Yeah.
And that his essay is one part of Discourse on the Worship of Priapus. And then Knight comes in with his idea that all religion started in the worship of the generative organs, as he delicately puts it. Kind of interesting in that it's almost kind of like a riff on that kind of idea of perennial religion that you get later with the Theosophical movement. All religions sprang from one source. So there's that angle to it. There's also this idea that this religion might have started in India, which becomes a thing later in the 19th century as well, when people are kind of looking for the origins of civilization. There's also this, as I say, this comparative religion angle to it, where he's looking at Indian statues and comparing them to Greek statues, and the formative structure. Oh, this is all worship of the generative organs. And I think that's quite a shift in the that kind of like Enlightenment view of mythology. Because before that, as far as I can, if I'm reading the text correctly, Enlightenment theorists tend to think of, it's all superstition, it's all nonsense. And this is a point where people start to take material objects like statues and jewelry and things seriously, and see, it's a kind of like, if you like, a first look at material culture rather than just going on ancient textual evidence. So the book is, I mean, it's quite a short book, and it was put out through the Society of Dilettanti. There's this bunch of, again, Horace Walpole said the only true qualification for being a member of the Dilettanti was being drunk. But it seems to have started off as a kind of social club for gentlemen who met on the Grand Tour.
Yes.
And they were involved in funding expeditions and going out and finding stuff that kind of got incorporated into collecting. There was a whole collecting mania in the 18th century, and it became not only a mark of a gentleman to have a collection of antiquities, but to actually know something about it as well. So you get all these kind of like quasi-scholarly essays. Another person who's involved in all this is this curious character called the Baron de Harkenville.
Yes.
I think he was French, and he wrote a treatise, the name of which escapes me at the moment, which is a very long French title, that I think was an influence on Payne Knight, because he said that all religions started in worship of the generative powers. But de Harkenville also wrote pornography. He did 2 scurrilous books on the lives of the Caesars, and I think one on Roman sexuality, which was supposedly illustrated with naughty pictures of Romans and Greeks having orgies and things, which got him thrown out of a number of countries. And he was this disreputable figure who was hanging around on the edges of the Knight and Hamilton circle. And then a few years after Discourse was published, it was one of those privately circulated texts initially, and then people got hold of it, and there was a kind of like a bit of a media frenzy, an 18th century media frenzy, if you like. This guy called Thomas Matthews said that Knight should be publicly burnt, and the book was blasphemous. That's where Knight's work dovetails into this dubious category of the obscene. where the worship of Priapus kind of jumps from being a scholarly treatise, albeit a very sort of anti-clericalist treatise, and kind of like falls into that shadow zone between scholarship and pornography.
This is all at the intersection of different things. You've got the Enlightenment project of explaining religion or explaining away religion. You've got the slightly less high-minded project of talking about penises. You've also got the colonial project of looking at Indian religion and seeing where that fits into it. It's a crossroads between several different strands of thought.
Yeah, and this is what fascinates me about it, this intersection between all these different strands of thought and how they go out in various ways. I mean, I looked at the Payne Knight and that whole kind of like genre's influence on contemporary paganism, and I can say, yeah, I can see the attraction here. He's saying that worship of the generative powers is perfectly natural, and it's only in Christianity that we find this abhorrence of it, and we have to judge these things, within the terms of their own culture. He was quite advanced in that sense. And I can see that argument as being very attractive to people into, if you like, esoteric history and paganism. And it's still something that circulates today. I found when I did lectures at Treble's bookshops, a lot of pagans were very interested in and supportive of this whole idea that this horror of sexuality is a Christian thing and so forth. But I guess that's really only the start of it, because this recent thing about the Elgin marbles has come up again.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Knight actually argued against the British Library's acquisition of the Elgin marbles. He didn't think they were interesting enough for the British Museum to acquire. And there was a kind of like, he got quite a lot of flack in the media at the time for trying to argue against the acquisition of these items. So he's this kind of like interesting, controversial character. Now, another thing that I suppose kept me interested in the whole idea of phallic religion, and it is a weird area. People say, "Oh, you're just a bearded white male with a phallus. That's why you're interested." But I think I've got more to it than that. I was very exercised a few years ago about the whole relationship between tantra and sex. You say to people nowadays tantra and they go sex instantly. I remember doing a lecture about it a few years ago, and I said to people in the audience, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word tantra? And one guy just looked at me and went, sting. But most people said sex. And I thought, where did this idea come from? It's not just something that emerged recently, I think, in the 1960s and 70s. But I formed this idea that maybe it had its roots, during the colonial period. So I started looking for, again, crossovers, and particularly in the revival of phallic worship, the revival of the idea of phallic religion that we get in the 19th century. That's one of the things that led me to getting interested in Edward Sellon and the Cannibal Club, which I've been writing about probably with rather more depth than many people are interested in. Because what we see there is again, so I think starting in the very early 19th century, this idea of the phallic origin of religion and all religions started in India being revived.
And Sellon himself was a colonial soldier in India, wasn't he?
Yeah, he served in the East India Company. I think he got to the rank of captain. Sounds slightly disreputable. Apparently, he threatened a brother officer with a pistol and nearly got cashiered. But again, he's one of these people who are difficult to classify, because he was a member of the London Anthropological Society, founded by James Hunt and Richard Burton. He delivered a couple of, if you like, early ethnographical papers, one about phallic worship in India, and one about Shakti Puja, which is the tantric kind of sexual rite. He also wrote pornography. Having immersed myself in virtually everything he wrote, when I was researching for my lecture, he comes across as quite a disreputable character. But what's interesting is that Richard Payne Knight bequeathed his collection of if you like, phallic antiquities to the British Museum. In
Hmm.
fact, he was an early trustee of the British Museum. And when at some point the museum wanted to reorganise that collection, who did they give the job to but Edward Sellon? And that made me think, well, that's interesting, because there's a perception, I think, that's still around today that the exponents of this idea of the phallic origin of religion were all kind of like dirty old aristocrats, chortling naughtily over their phallic sculptures and, nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Yeah.
And perhaps there was an element of that to it, because we know that a lot of the people in the Cannibal Club, which was the, if you like, the inner circle of the London Anthropological Society, wrote pornography. Sellon did, several other people did, So there's this kind of like seedy element to it. But what I found as I continued to research was that not only was there that angle to it and the writing of erotica, but also the British Museum and other major institutions of the period took these theories of the phallic origin of religious worship seriously and started their own collections. Collections were bequeathed to them by various wealthy Victorian enthusiasts for this theory and got incorporated into their collections. And
Sellon also had something of an ideological agenda, didn't he? He was anti-clerical in the same way that Payne Knight had been.
Oh yeah, very much so. He comes across as quite a reprehensible character. His last book was called The Ups and Downs of Life, and it was a kind of erotic biography of him that he wrote for George Campbell Ready, who was a member of the Cannibal Club, who was a kind of like enthusiastic pornographer. And yeah, he hates his wife. He sees he doesn't like his children. He seems to be continually short of money. He spent some time, I think, driving a coach between London and Cambridge, I think it was. And when the railways came, that put paid to that job. And he tried, I think he tried to run a fencing school at some point. That didn't work out. And I think he turned to writing erotica as a way of making money. But yeah, if you read his erotic biography, The Ups and Downs of Life, he comes across as quite a nasty character. Shot himself in the end. As far as I can make out, what happened was that he was engaged by one of his friends to act as a kind of chaperone and guide around Italy. I think they got as far as Venice, and they were in a train carriage, and the guy had gone to sleep, and he woke up to find Sellon enthusiastically seducing his mistress, and they had a big argument. Sellon was promptly fired on the spot, spent a few weeks wandering around Europe, came back to England, booked himself in a hotel in London and shot himself, and left this kind of like epigraphic poem as his suicide note with the words, "Vivat lingam, it shall not rise again," something like that. So he's been compared to as a kind of Harry Flashman type character.
Oh yes,
it's interesting because if you concentrate on his pornographic travails, he comes across as a thoroughly disreputable character. But he's also one of the early re-exponents, if you like, of this idea of the phallic origin of religion, and seating that, if you like, phallic origin, those phallic worship stuff in India, which is interesting for me. And he also, delivers ethnographic essays and is engaged by the British Museum to organise the Knight collection. And this again is what interested me, because I was getting into this murky subject of ethnopornography, which is the idea that a scholarly text can be read as an erotic text, or an erotic text can be read as a scholarly text. And this is something I find fascinating again about this whole kind of like phallic origin theory of religion, is that it can be deployed in so many different ways. So I found one 19th century text that draws on that idea and to simultaneously bash Catholics. It's basically saying, oh, the cross as a Christian symbol is a kind of like a development of the phallus. This is bad. Therefore, all Catholics are, degenerate. We know from in the 19th century there was a lot of anti-Catholic feeling. And at the same time, they're comparing the cross and the phallus to the Hindu lingam. So they're kind of bashing Catholics and Indian culture at the same time. And then there's this whole idea of symbolism and its relationship to the idea of the generative powers gets streamed into the interpretation of Freemasonry, I think largely by Hargrave Jennings.
Yes.
And that can be used either to support, the idea of esoteric Freemasonry or to bash it.
Jennings' work is interesting, isn't it? I mean, he was Freemason, Rosicrucian. He wrote his book about the Rosicrucians, but it's not really about the Rosicrucians, is it?
It's mostly about Phallic worship, and I think a lot of these. I think Jennings had a terrific output. He wrote about 30 or 40 books in quite a short period of time. There doesn't seem to be much scholarly writing on him. He seems to be one of these people who've kind of like dropped off the scholarly radar. I wonder if the whole idea of Phallic worship or this whole theory, I think it was seen as odd and bizarre and kind of seedy and slightly disgusting. That has changed, but I think there's still more work to be done to uncover the various connections.
Yes.
It's one of my kind of many interests, and I'm still pursuing it slowly. And that I think what I'd like to do is look at early sexological writings and see how that phallic origin theory sort of starts percolating through in the work of people like Ellis and Ulrichs and so forth. But I think that's a continuation of the project, because I'm still turning up all these various obscure bits of 19th century writing that are drawing on this theory in a variety of ways. And it's certainly been, I think, influential on contemporary occultism.
Yes, definitely, yes. And I believe in the High Victorian period, you have a reissue of Payne Knight's work.
Yes.
And you have Thomas Wright adding to that with his essay on the worship of the generative powers in the Middle Ages. And that comes to be cited by Crowley and Gardner and Dion Fortune.
Well, because I'm a complete either nerd stroke obsessive, I did check all the references in Crowley and Gardner and Dion Fortune, and mostly they're not actually referencing Knight's essay in that reissue, but they are referencing Thomas Wright. And I think, was the other guy Westrop? I'm not quite sure, but there were two essays appended to John Houghton's original 19th century reissue of Discourse, and it is mostly Thomas Wright, who I think was quite a respectable scholar, as I recall. Certainly not have this kind of like shady side to him that Knight did. When I first started to look at that, I think it was 1865 reissue, because it was done by John Houghton, who was very famous for producing books with titles such as Lady Bumtickler's Revels or Fanny Hill. I thought, oh, Houghton must be, like William Dugdale. He's a one of these smut trade publishers. But actually, he was, he published Mark Twain, he published William Whitman and Swinburne. So he was one of these people who published a lot of radical materials, some of which just happened to be smut. And that was, again, something that fascinated me as I started to do the research on Selwyn, because, again, we have this popular idea of Victorian culture as being very sexually repressed. And what we find when we dig into it is very much the opposite.
Yeah, definitely. The Victorians were a lot more interesting than we give them credit for.
Yeah, definitely. The porn trade in that kind of like 1850s Britain just seemed to be massive. And again, that was something interesting to me, is how this category of what was considered obscene was very much a kind of class thing. Most of the focus of things like the 1857 Obscene Publications Act and so forth, all seem to be worried about the lower classes getting hold of this material. Well, whilst the upper classes were seen to be, oh, well, they're educated, so they won't be corrupted by it. The members of the Cannibal Club, for instance, who wrote quite risque pornography under assumed titles, it was all privately published, privately circulated for gentlemen of a certain taste. Something I found interesting in reading some of the early, some scholarship about all these people is that they're kind of held up as sex rebels. And then you look at them, you find, well, actually, no, they're rich dilettantes, or they're members of they're MPs or high-ranking members of the army or diplomats. But, these are all really well-heeled people who can just avoid. I don't think any of them were ever prosecuted for publishing obscene material because they did it privately and they had contacts.
Yes, there's a sense, isn't there, in which while you could see Payne Knight and Jennings and these other people as being rebels against their own culture, they were also very, very much embedded in the cultural background of the time. They could not have lived at any other time. The particular interests they had, the fact that they were bringing a classical education to bear on this material as upper-class English gentlemen, the fact they were bringing in material from colonial India, the fact they were, in some cases, engaged in this Enlightenment project of trying to find a single source of all religion. They were very, very much men of their time, even if they looked like rebels.
Yeah. They're not like us, and they certainly were not rebels in the sense that they were, somehow transgressing the mores of Victorian society, because they were largely, speaking to their own audiences, if you like.
Yeah, it's fair to say that they weren't Christians, and they were prepared to break sexual taboos, but in other respects, they were very much men of their time, and they were men. I mean, that's the other thing about these people, isn't it? We don't find female figures writing on these subjects.
Well, and James Hunt and Richard Burton were originally members of the London Ethnographical Society, and they formed their own group, the London Anthropological Society. And one of the reasons they did that was that the ethnographicals were considering having women in their meetings, and of course that would kind of like shatter the homosocial male only. Let's talk about the sexuality of the African natives, ho, kind of like angle. And, I think Hunt and Burton didn't want women around whilst they fondled their phallic objects and talked about the sexuality of the natives,
That there's a definite air of the locker room about these writings.
Yeah.
These male writers talking to each other about phalluses.
I had this image of them sitting around a dinner table and somebody quoting, say, Marshall or another classical author who wrote naughty poems, and then kind of like, oh, let's create a story around this, And we know that they did that. They almost, went out for dinner and created the plots for pornographic essays around the dinner table amongst themselves.
The classical element of this is interesting, and this goes back to Payne Knight, doesn't it? Because Payne Knight appealed to Priapus, who's the ancient phallic god that you find in Roman texts. And so the classicism of this is very important. The inheritance of the English gentleman's education that these men brought to their work.
Yeah, it is interesting. And as I said, I think prior to the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum, we see this kind of the view of the classical Greek and Roman cultures as being very austere and noble. Yes. And the sudden discovery of all these sexual antiquities kind of like shatters that. There's one of the 19th century curators of the British Museum who still felt that discourse was a blasphemous tome which had to be hidden away. Again, this is another interesting angle of it, because another question I started to think about was, how did these, if you like, the rediscovery of or the discovery that the Romans and Greeks had attitudes towards sexuality that were different to people in the 18th century? How far do we see that percolating through? And we do. Take, for example, Anne Lister. And we know that Anne Lister studied, read Greek and was, if you like, turned on by the poems of Sappho, and in fact used those classical Greek allusions to lesbianism to chat up other women. And you find the same thing that with the names of Ganymede or Antinous, that these become codes for people in, as early as the 18th century, for people, let's say, interested in their own sex.
Yes. And this also happens in the 19th century, doesn't it? You have the Uranian movement in the time of Oscar Wilde, which draws on that same classical discourse.
Yeah, and was it John Symonds, A Problem of Greek Ethics?
That guy, yes. And there was the Order of Chironeia, with gay men in Victorian society identifying with ancient Greek warriors.
And the higher Hellenism, I think it was referred to.
And in fact, there was the phrase Greek love that was used to describe homosexuality among men. And there was an interesting letter that Oscar Wilde wrote. He went to visit, of all people, Cardinal Newman. And he then wrote to one of his friends saying, I had heard that Cardinal Newman was an aficionado of Greek love, and now I know it. Yeah. So he triggered Oscar Wilde's gaydar, which is no small thing.
Oh yeah, I haven't really pushed down that particular path yet, but it is again an interesting consequence of, if you like, the discovery of classical sexuality.
There's one other angle that it's worth going back to, I think, and that's the colonial Indian angle, because all of this, as we've said, is deeply bound up with the imperial encounter with Indian religions.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's interesting because it's not the standard official Christian missionary discourse.
Yeah.
It's a discourse in which these Western scholars, these white Brits, look to India as a source of data. But it's still somewhat problematic because they're not actually embracing Indian religions on their own terms. They're still looking at Indian religions as a source of data for formulating their own theories.
Well, this is true, and I think this is something I've perhaps approached at a slightly different angle. At an early phase, if you like, in my following my different lines of research interests, I began to think about this whole idea of, as I said earlier, tantra and sexuality. And I started looking at a lot of missionary writings about India in the 18th and 19th century. And it's very much, a kind of a heart of darkness in the sense of Joseph Conrad.
Yeah.
Going to India, it's going to fuck you up, basically. The horror that you get in the writings of people like the Abbé Dubois and William Ward. And I did quite a bit of research on William Ward, interesting, British missionary living in India and doing this massive, if you like, ethnographic study of Indian religion as he saw it. His writings are just full of the horror of anything remotely sexual. He's one of the first Europeans to describe Tantra, and he says, this is stuff that's cannot be revealed on paper to a Christian public. It's too horrible to write. It's almost like this idea of the unnameable. Like sodomy is this absent reference. It's too horrible to even contemplate. What started to interest me about that is that at what point did India go from being this kind of like zone of terror and darkness and the whole idea of being sexual or licentious to being sexy? When did the kind of like the horror of the orgium become, if you like, let's go to India to shag the natives? Woohoo! It's this transition from the horror of untraveled sexuality in a hot country to where did that become sexy? And I see that as almost kind of like something we get towards the end of the 19th century. And I started looking at examples of pornography that's set in India, and I could only find 4 things. India does not seem to be a popular place for the pornographic writer to set their adventures, which is one interesting thing.
Yes.
I mean, Stellan does in his Ups and Downs biography, but that's a kind of like a look into the past, because he's looking back to the halcyon days, certainly before the rebellion, where he was a member of an officer for the East India Company. And I think what happened was post-rebellion and looking at English reportage of what was happening during the rebellion, you get all these horror stories about how awful India is and the obscene practices of the natives. As we move towards the end of the 19th century, that's when you get Burton's translation of the Kama Sutra and another Indian love text he did, and almost a kind of like, I guess, a kind of sense of nostalgia about the halcyon days when British officers could have native mistresses and nobody criticised them for it. And I think that's the period where, instead of the horror of Indian sexual licentiousness, you get it becoming this it's an ancient sexuality being romanticized.
That goes hand in hand in that same period with the fetishization of Indian religion in Theosophy and the Golden Dawn and those sorts of movements, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, the whole comparative thing is interesting, because that starts a lot earlier. And I mentioned that Payne Knight's discourse could be seen as an early example of comparative religion. But of course, roughly around the same time, you've got Sir William Jones, the great Sanskritists, writing poetry, where he's making specific links between ancient Greek goddesses and Indian goddesses. That 18th century romanticism you get about India is another facet of that. But the impression I got from reading a lot of the 19th century literature is that India was kind of seen as fascinating but remote for the most part, and it was the rebellion that brought it into sharp focus for a lot of people in a lot of the ordinary people in England. And then post rebellion, you get this if you like Orientalist romanticism, and again the resurgence of the idea that India is the wellspring of religion, and certainly you see that in Blavatsky.
I guess the two competitors as the wellspring of religion in that period would have been India and Egypt, on the other hand.
Yes, very much so. Interestingly enough, some of the occult ideas about that was that the people who built the pyramids were not the people living there now. I remember encountering those in the 70s and 80s. Within an occult context, those ideas circulated. The people, the scruffy buggers who live there now were not the great people who built the pyramids.
Yeah.
So again, you've got that sort of colonialist angle. In the same way that you get about India, all the people who live there now were degenerates and not the original inhabitants.
Yes, and unfortunately, it's an idea that you got and sometimes still get in the study of ancient Greece and Rome too. Okay, well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time for today, but that's been really interesting. We've had some enlightenment there on an area of religious studies which still isn't understood as it should be. Phil Hine, it's been great to have you on the show.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks very much.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.